Today we're doing Bendy and the Ink Machine and Bendy and the Dark Revival review. So today we have another sort of strange one, sort of like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but strange in a different way. I decided to play these games because I found the idea of cartoons as horror pretty interesting, because cartoons can be kind of creepy. They commit what would be really extremely violent acts against each other, but because the characters don't really suffer for more than a couple seconds, it's fine for children. But that isn't really what this game's going for, so I was kind of disappointed when nobody was violently murdered by having a giant anvil drop on them. It's more of a horror game with a cartoon theme than a cartoon game with a horror theme. I think the closest thing that's done with that is the Cuphead games, but that's not very full horror. But I did end up liking these games, but for different reasons than I thought I would. They actually had surprisingly good story and world building. So we'll get into all that, and we'll start off with Bendy and the Ink Machine. Before we get into the rest of the video, I'd like to mention that my Steam game, Laser Rush Reloaded, has a demo available to play right now. Shoot, climb, slash, dash, jump, slide, and ride into the most intense roller coaster of a movement shooter platformer that you've ever played. Experience challenging, chaotic combat and high-stakes platforming at the same time. Fight at top speed and laser rush. Bendy 1 does have its fair share of traditional horror hide-and-seek gameplay. That's mediocre as it ever is. But there's luckily more to it than that. There's some decent gameplay variety for this game. There's some very basic melee combat against these weaker enemies. Even though that boils down to just whack until they die, it's pretty good for pacing and making you not feel like you're doing the same stuff over and over. There's fairly good boss fights with decent gimmicks. I never knew how much I wanted to fight a amusement park ride till I did. Although I have to mention that boss was a bit fairly low flamey for me, at least. But it was still good. The puzzles are decent. Pretty standard though, horror game puzzles. They do throw a tiny bit of cinematic gameplay sections in there as well. One thing to gripe about though is that a lot of the mission design for the overall missions are based around collectathons. You go collect 6 whatevers to open whatever door. The attempts at being scary are pretty mediocre, which is unfortunately pretty standard for most horror games. The story is pretty good once it gets going. The villains are distinct, and the heroes are memorable and likable. Boris is probably my favorite character in the series. Do some interesting concepts, like the idea of cartoons coming to life is treated like a sci-fi AI story. The world building is really good. It's not just hallways filled with monsters. It's this studio system based around the Bendy cartoon, and the environments and even the monsters had their own civilizations. The aesthetics are fairly good. The black on yellow paper encapsulates every environment, prop, and character, and it's fairly good. Although I don't like how interactables are highlighted in yellow, and it's hard to see. That's a situation where the art style sort of stepped away for the UX for a moment. There's pretty good environment variety. I like how it starts with the small studio and expands to different industries and, like I said, the monster civilizations based around the cartoons. There's fairly good creature design and character design, although the main gooey ink enemies aren't too good though. They're pretty generic. The music is also fairly decent. Overall, it's a pretty solid horror game, and I'm giving it an 8.03. Actually, I've been in the Dark Revival. Starting with the gameplay, the combat is mostly the same, outside of adding like stealth kills, which are okay. But I feel like it was a fairly big missed opportunity to upgrade the combat. Like, just adds a little more, add like a block, add like a dodge, something. They did add some like special powers, but they're not well utilized. There's a Dishonored style Link ability, but the stealth doesn't really call for it, and it's mostly used to solve puzzles. There's like one boss where you need to use it to dodge one of his moves, but no regular enemies that do that. That would have been good. The horror hide and seek sections are shorter and less overall, but this time a lot of them are random, which I guess is supposed to keep you on your toes, but ends up being more annoying in practice. Also, they do a similar thing with a certain enemy that will spawn in front of you, hit you, and run away, which did get me a bit. Was an extremely cheap jump scare. There's not really too much cinematic gameplay and less gameplay variety in general, but it was never bad enough that I got bored. There are new crafting and upgrade systems, but the combat doesn't have enough depth for it to really feel like it matters. The bosses are not as good as Bendy 1, but they're still alright. Lastly, a few particular things. There's a few sections with enemies that can't be stealth killed or attacked in general that force you to stuff around them. That kind of suck. The last chapter is kind of weak, but that being said, the actual ending is alright, even if it's a bit cheesy at times. The story is still pretty good. It dives deeper into the concept set up in the first game. The characters are still good, and the new main character gets to have more personality this time than the first guy. The environments are still really good, although they're a tiny bit less varied. I do like how they seem more detailed this time. And the city section is really good. I wish that lasted longer. Altogether, the atmosphere is still pretty good. Overall, I don't think it's quite as good as the first one, but it wasn't apparent until I started critiquing it. So it's pretty close. And I'm giving Bendy 2 a 7.93. Overall, a fairly good series for that's not great on gameplay, but not horribly boring on gameplay. But has fairly good story, aesthetics, and world building. So probably something to check out if you like the day cartoon horror, even if it's not as cartoony as I would want. Thank you to anyone who likes, comments, or subscribes. That's it.